Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to lesson number 17 of our Databases and SQL video tutorials course. Today we'll be talking about grouping data together. So what you're going to learn in this lesson is why grouping data together is actually helpful, how to visualize grouping data in your mind. I find this is probably one of the most important exercises with respect to the grouping topic. I had a lot of difficulty with grouping because I didn't exactly know how it worked behind the scenes, what SQL really did, and how to visualize what SQL was doing in the back of my mind. I couldn't do it, so I struggled. So I'll teach you exactly how to do that. And then we'll look at the examples of some grouping and some syntax as well for grouping data, because obviously, just having the knowledge of this stuff and the theory behind it's no good. You need to know how to do it in practice with the syntax and with examples. So let's get started. So grouping data. In the world of databases, being able to read and interpret data is not just helpful, it's the whole reason why we have data in the first place. I mean, sure, we can store data for like usernames and passwords, but above and beyond that, once you get into the world of things like reporting software and actually being able to report interesting findings on data, which is the whole reason why data really exists, that's where we really get into the nitty-gritty of really truly using databases. So specifically, like I said, reading and interpreting data is helpful, but specifically being able to look at the data and group it into similar data points, okay? Grouping them together is very, very powerful. So this kind of data grouping is often found, like I mentioned, in the world of reports and reporting. You're surely familiar with grouping data. I guarantee you've seen this before, because some examples include grouping age ranges together for surveys or demographics. So if you ever filled out a survey where you've had to say, are you between the ages of 18 and 25, 26 and 35, et cetera, that is their attempt to group data together because they want to, they feel as though there is something significant about each of those groups of data points. Okay, that's why they're grouping it in the first place. Grouping transaction types together to form your bank statements. Okay, so for example, at the end of the month, you'll get perhaps some sort of a spreadsheet that tells you, or some sort of a graph that tells you if you are cash flow positive or cash flow negative. Okay, and they can figure that out because they've been able to group together the types of transactions, the credits with the debits, put them together, and decide when you add them all up in their individual groups, which side is bigger. Is it the negatives that are bigger or the positives that are bigger? And then you know at a glance if you are cash flow positive or negative. Or also grouping recorded website traffic into hours of the day. Okay, this is important for me. I would like to know when people are most active at visiting my websites. Okay, so we can group the data for all the people that have ever visited my website for a certain month, let's say. I can take each data point and group it together per hour of the day. So you would create 24 different hours and put it into 24 different slots, and you could see by counting each of those slots, you could see which one is the biggest, therefore which one is the most popular. So that's just some very, very simple ideas of grouping, and there's plenty more examples of how to group data together. So, how should you think about grouping data? So this is all about the visualization technique. So the best exercise that I can think of to master grouping data or data grouping is to think about buckets. Okay, really think about an actual bucket, with the handle. It could be metal, it could be plastic, whatever. It's a bucket. Look at how you want to actually group your data together. Okay, so you have to figure out, what criteria am I thinking of when I want to be able to group my data together? And we'll get into some examples of that in just a second. But then assign each of those areas to a particular bucket. So you don't have to actually obviously create a bucket, but create it in your mind. Think of a bucket in your mind. And then look at each of the data points that you have. Go over each individual data point. Okay, so it would be a representation of a row in your database. That's one data point. And decide for each of those data points, which bucket would they fall into? Which bucket would you put that row of data into? Okay? So by the end of that, you will have data distributed across multiple buckets. It could be 2 buckets, it could be 200,000 buckets, okay? Who knows how you're grouping, what criteria you have behind your grouping. But by the end, you will have distributed the data across multiple buckets, okay? So let's think about an example. Think about the bank transactions example that I was just talking about. Each transaction is either a debit transaction or a credit transaction. Okay, so that means you have either a transaction where you are losing money from your bank account, so you're making a purchase, which is a debit, or a transaction where you're gaining money. Let's say like a paycheck or someone gives you some money. That's called a credit. Okay, debit or credit. So since you have two different areas of which to divide these transactions, this means that you're dealing with two buckets. One is a debit bucket, and the other is a credit bucket. And again, these are just buckets that exist in your mind. SQL behind the scenes doesn't actually create buckets, but it creates something similar to buckets. So now go through each of the transactions for this particular month and place them into one of the two buckets. So you go through, all the transactions. Okay, so the first transaction I made was, a $100 purchase for, I don't know, some fancy soap or something. So that would be a debit. Okay, and that would be a $100 transaction that we would put into our debit bucket. Okay, and then maybe the second one is also purchase. It's a $50 purchase for, I don't know, maybe a gift certificate or something like that. So it's another debit. We put it into the debit bucket. And then so on and so forth. Maybe the next one, maybe you got paid a big paycheck. Maybe you made like $3,000. So you put that into your credit bucket. Now you can see you're distributing your transactions, your data points across buckets. Okay, so now you're in a position, once you're done with all that, once you've gone through the entire, span of transactions that you wish to go through, now you are in a position to add up each of those transactions in each bucket to determine your cash flow. So it's simple. You just go to the, bucket, the debit bucket, add up all those transactions. Here's your total. You go to your credit bucket, you add up all those transactions. Here's the total. Now you can ask yourself the question, did I make money or lose money this month? And you can have an easy answer by looking at these two numbers and adding them together. And if it's a positive amount, then you made money. If it's a negative amount, then you lost money. Okay. Now this seems like a fairly cumbersome process, but our RDBMSs, our like MySQL server, is very, very quick to do this for us. Okay. Not as quick as just doing a plain old reading of data, but it is still very quick. So how can we, let's repeat this exercise. Okay, let's repeat it with website traffic just so you really get the idea of what's going on. We'll have some more buckets this time. So let's assume that we've recorded each visitor that has landed upon our website, has stumbled upon our website for the last 30 days. So we have 30 days worth of data points. Each visitor arrived on our website at a particular time, which of course we've tracked through whatever means that we had to track this particular data. Maybe we had a website application backing our website that would log all the visitors as well as the time and maybe where they came from, et cetera, and it logged it all into a database table. Okay, so we could have potentially, tens of thousands of rows of data points inside of our database table. Okay, so now we'd like to know when our website is the busiest. So at what time of day is the busiest time of day for my website? It's a simple question to ask, but it's a little bit complex to answer. But it becomes less complex because we can group data together. So we can create 24 buckets in our mind. Again, in our mind, this is not what SQL does. But we can have one bucket for each hour of the day. So we have, the first hour of the day, which could be represented by bucket, 1 or 0, depending on how you want to do it. Probably bucket 0 would represent like midnight and forward. And then bucket 1 would be from 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. And then bucket 2 would be from 2 a.m. to 3 a.m. And so on and so forth, all the way to bucket number 23, which is from, whatever that is, 11 p.m. to 11:59 p.m. or something like that, okay? So we have 0 to 23 buckets, which is 24 buckets total. So now we'd look at each one of our visitors, each one of our data points in our data table, and we would see which bucket they would fall into. So we take the first visitor and, okay, he landed on our website at 6:23 a.m. So that would go into bucket number 5. Bucket number 6, I guess. So 6 a.m. to 6:59 whatever a.m. So that would be that bucket. And then you get the idea. You go through and you pick, okay, this guy was at 10 p.m., so he falls into this bucket. This guy was at whatever p.m. or and you start filling in your buckets based on the hour that they visited. Now, once we've done this for each visitor, we'll know which bucket is the most full. We just look at whatever bucket. We do something called a count. Okay, I'll get into these things in probably more so in the next lesson, but I'll mention what these are called at the end of this lesson. We'll do a count on each bucket to be able to count each of the data points in the bucket very easily and very quickly, and we'll know by whichever one is the maximum number, whichever one has the maximum number of entries in it, we'll know that that is the most popular hour for our website. Okay, so there you go. And then we can answer the question, what time of day is the busiest time of day for my website? Well, there we go. We know in the last, 30 days, this time, whatever it is that we found, maybe, 12 p.m. is the busiest time for our website. Cool. So grouping data. It's all about being able to answer more complex questions about our data. So more complex questions, if you think of an easy question might be, how many website visitors have we had since the beginning of time? Okay, that's an easy question because we already know how to solve it. We just say select star from website visitors, and we will know based on the number of data points that come back, because our programs that we use are usually pretty handy, and they usually just give us the count for all the rows that are returned. We'll know exactly the answer to that question. So how many visitors have we had since the beginning of time? We query this hypothetical. This is just a hypothetical table that I've made up in my mind. We select star from website visitors, and there you go. It'll tell us, there's been 300,000 website visitors because there's 300,000 rows in this table. So there we go. That's an easy way to answer that question because it's an easy query. A tougher question is, well, which day of the week tends to be the slowest? Okay, you see how that question lends itself to grouping of the data. Which day of the week tends to be the slowest? Well, here we don't have any. Where is it? Yeah, how many website visitors have we had since the beginning of time? Here we don't have any slots. Okay, if you think about it in terms of breaking it down into buckets and how to arrange our data, there's no concept of buckets in this first question. How many website visitors have we had since the beginning of time? There would be one bucket. It would be since the beginning of time to now is where all of our visitors would fall into. So since there's only one bucket, we don't need to group it. It's already grouped for us because it returns it all for us, right? Whereas this one, which day of the week tends to be the slowest? Well, which day of the week? How many days of the week are there? Well, there's 7 days of the week. So since we're dealing with 7 days of the week, that lends itself, that hints at needing to be used for grouping. We need to use grouping to answer this question. Okay, so that's kind of a trick that I use. I look at the questions that are being asked, and I ask myself, is there any part of that question where I could create these virtual buckets in my mind to put the data into to answer the question? Because in order to answer this question, which day of the week tends to be the slowest, we need to know the traffic for each day of the week, which is each one of 7 days of the week. So we would have 7 buckets, and we would go through that same process of putting data into each of those buckets in our mind, or obviously with our code, or our scripts, which is what I'm going to be showing you very soon. Okay, so that's the strategy behind it. All right, so good stuff. We'll call it quits for this half of the lesson. So please join me in the next video, which will be the next half of this grouping video, this grouping lesson that we've been learning together. And that'll be the next one, and I look forward to seeing you there. So bye for now.